fishing, it's in my soul. Welcome to the Salt Strong Podcast, disrupting fishing entertainment as you know it. Prepare to laugh. Prepare to get to know fishing legends in a whole new and unfiltered way. And on occasion, you might even learn a thing or two about fishing. Here's your host, Joe Simons. Like diamonds.
Hello, Salt Strong Nation. Joe Simons, like diamonds. We are back again. This is going to be a really special one. A lot of you know that I am an avid reader. I've been on a quest for, I guess now 5 or 6 years to try to read a book a week. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. But this past week, I have read an amazing book, and I didn't know how old this was until talking to Mark, but it's Through the Fish's Eye. And Mark Sosin, probably a man for most of you that does not need an introduction. But Mark, please do kind of tell us a little bit about your past. The man who is, probably had the longest running saltwater TV show and a Hall of Famer in multiple places. Tell us kind of the brief history of where you grew up and some of the best memories and accolades.
Well, my father fished, and he started me, he said, when I was 3 years old. I don't remember that, but I think he caught a trout on a fly rod and handed me the rod to hold for a minute, and he considered that I was fishing. but I really loved it all my life, and I fished with him until I got old enough, and then I continued. My formal training was for corporate management. I gave that up, and I started doing stuff that I knew nothing about, writing magazine pieces, talking on the radio, and making television shows. So I've spent more than 50 years doing that. But of everything I've done, I have been told by people that I consider very important that Through the Fish's Eye is probably one of the 10 best books ever written on fishing.
Yep, I agree.
And Joe, let me tell you why. It's 50 years old. I wrote it 50 years ago. I live near a Federal Marine Research Laboratory, and they had a 30,000-gallon aquarium that took water from a bay, so it was pure salt water. And they studied bluefish for 7 years. And I used to go there and watch them take notes and, what they were doing. They could have moonrise, moonset, sunrise, sunset, rain, snow, whatever they wanted. And I said, well, why don't you tell people these things? And they said, oh, no, if a scientist talks to the public, he loses his credibility in the scientific world. Huh. I said, that's not very smart. But I did find a scientist, John Clark, who was a marine biologist, who would talk to me, and I made him a co-author. I wrote the book, but I had John there to check me on anything I said to make sure that it was current knowledge among marine biologists at that time. And Arnold Gingrich, who started Esquire magazine, and told me that it was one of the 10 best books ever written on fishing. And I did it 50. Oh, I got to tell you one other thing, Joe.
Yeah.
The best market for a book in those days was Outdoor Life Book Club. I mean, if they took your book, you made money. And they agreed to take this book. So I delivered the manuscript, and they decided that nobody would read it. So they put it away for a couple of years. And Harper and Row came along, saw it, and said, we'll publish it. Harper and Row published the book. But they took 40% of the original manuscript and threw it away.
Wow. Do you still have the other, the long lost manuscript?
I do somewhere.
I'd love to see it, because what shocked me when you said this was 50 years old, I read the whole thing, and there wasn't a single time where I said, oh, that doesn't apply now, because it was all based on real science and biology. And as you know, science and biology, doesn't change like, mono versus fluoro and now the braided line, because you didn't really talk about equipment. It was more about the science and the behavior of these game fish and these predator fish. And I thought it was just so fascinating. There was, you could become such a better fisherman just by reading books like this. It was really, really well done.
Well, like you, Joe, I was amazed when I started hearing this from scientists and saying, why don't you tell us? Oh, no, my goodness. And so I decided to do it.
Well, that's great. Well, I want to kick it off by starting in this twilight hours. And this was cool for me to read. We have been talking and sharing with our audience for years now about the importance of the twilight hours, and it's a feeding time, and I think most people agree on that. But when you really dive down and say, well, why? I haven't really heard a good answer, like a science-based behavior answer. And you talk all about that, about the feeding and the light adjustment that's happening with these fish, and really dive in on why the twilight hours are such an important time. Do you mind sharing some of kind of more the behavior and science-based reasons?
Oh, yeah, I'd be glad to. Most fish have what they call rod and cone receptors. In sunlight, they use both of them, but when it's dark, they only use one of them. And they have other things, too, that help them home in. For example, the lateral line. The lateral line, excuse me, all fish have a lateral line. On the snook, it's very obvious. It's a black line down the side of a fish that goes from the head to the tail.
Yep.
But with this lateral line, within 20 feet or so, they are incredibly accurate. So they can hold the position and come out and hit something and not miss it.
And then what happens outside of, you said 20 feet is when they're spot on. What happens outside of that? The lateral line's not as effective?
Well,
or at all?
They have all kinds of things. They can smell, they can hear, they can do things that we never consider. It's just amazing to me. And when I learned it, it was even more amazing. And later on in our talk, I want to take you to something that I learned after the book, which is just incredible.
So tell me what that is, or at least what the subject is, so I can make sure to remind you. I'll write it down.
I'll tell you right now.
All right.
Several years ago, I found out that a man in Penn State University was working on his doctorate degree in biology. And he was studying, and I know this is saltwater, but he was studying trout in a stream. And he built a place where he could hide and watch these things. It was an elevated structure, and he studied them for 5 years. And he taught me so much. He taught me that no two fish are exactly the same color-wise. And he taught me that these fish hold in specific positions. And I want to take you to salt water with that. To me, it's the most fabulous thing that I've learned in years. And I know you want to talk about the book, but if I were adding to it today, this is what I do. And I'd like people to know this.
Yeah.
And anyway, the trout would hold in a specific place, and he would photograph them. And he showed me pictures taken a year apart. And that position was so precise that you could superimpose the eyes of the fish, and that's how close it was. And if you caught one that took him out of there, another one came and held that same spot.
That's crazy.
Now let me take you to saltwater with some examples. Once you realize that these fish had positions, I was talking to a saltwater biologist, and he needed to get 3 or 4 snook for a study he was doing. He said, "You want to ride with me?" Sure. I jumped in a little skiff, and he rode 10 minutes across this little bay, and he anchored in the spot, and he cast. And I said, if I were working the shoreline, I'd make a cast in there and then go on, and maybe I'd catch a snook. So he catches the first snook. He doesn't move. Throws it to the same spot. 5 minutes later, catches a second snook. Waits 5 minutes, throws it in there again, catches a third snook. That spot was critical. Absolutely critical.
So tell me why. Is it because this was just a prime time feeding spot? I mean, was it a little drop off, a pothole? What was it?
Nobody figured, at least when I was doing it, nobody figured out why they chose those spots. But let me give you examples in salt water. I needed to get photographs of a permit.
Okay.
That's a fish species for those who don't know. And this young captain took me out in the ocean in the Florida Keys. And most of the time you go in what they call the backcountry in the shallow flats. He takes me in the deeper water. He anchors the boat in a position. I see no reference or anything. He said, "Put the bait directly astern and you'll have a permit within 2 or 3 minutes." And I did, and it happened. And how he knew, I don't know. Then I tarpon fished with another guy, and he used to fish the bridges. On an outgoing tide, he fished one span. On an incoming tide, he fished another span, and the tarpon were in both places at that time. Then you go figure it out.
It's wild. And from what I'm hearing you're saying, you're not saying just the general area. I mean that.
No. Joe, it was so specific that he would anchor the boat into place, and he said, "You got to make a cast there, and when the current drags it around where it straightens out, you'll have a fish."
Wow.
And he did this day after day after day.
It makes sense. I mean, I remember a dock that we fished not that long ago, and we pulled a redfish out, and a lot of times it made a ton of noise, and a lot of times you think, we've probably kind of blown out the spot. We waited a little bit, made a few more casts, and in the exact same spot, I'm talking the exact same skip, we caught 5 more redfish. We total of 6 redfish under one just normal residential dock. But if we cast 4 feet over the other side, we weren't getting anything. It was, as you're saying this, I'm remembering that trip saying, wow, it was almost like the fish were only in this one exact spot.
You probably didn't realize it at the time, because I wouldn't have realized it at the time, but that's exactly what this guy was studying for his PhD.
So
he knew that those fish were in the same spot, and I'm giving you example after example after example. I have fished with 2 different captains, one in the Northeast for striped bass and bluefish, and another in the Everglades for redfish and trout and all that. And he would change spots every few minutes because he knew that the fish moved and they'd be in these different spots. And it was incredible.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I got to get this. Go for it.
Let me interrupt you for a minute.
Yeah.
We may leave the audience with a spot that just because you catch one fish out of a spot doesn't mean there won't be another one there in a couple of minutes.
Yep.
So it pays, if you find a spot that has a fish, work it for a few minutes, see what happens.
And guys, this is from an angler who has got a Hall of Fame to his name in both saltwater and freshwater. One of the few people alive to do that. So that's so cool. I got to get the name of this scientist and see if I could get my hands on his thesis or research paper. I think that's so fascinating.
I can't remember his name.
Got it.
It was a quick thing. and I wrote a story. They sent me out there to write the story on it, and I was just amazed.
Yeah, that is so cool. So cool.
And there's a lot of stuff like that. For example, you don't have to ask somebody else where they caught the fish. Ask them how deep the water was. You familiar with that?
Yeah, no, please keep going.
Well, for some reason, in saltwater at least, if you start catching fish at a certain depth, you want to be at that depth. For some reason, they're there. We don't always know all the answers. That's the problem. I can't sit here. I'm not a scientist, so I can't sit here and give you all the details of why, but I can tell you the results of what happens. And, if you're trolling or if you're drifting in the face or whatever you're doing, if they're at one depth, they should be at that depth someplace else too.
And
I can't give you the answers why.
Well, after reading your book, I mean, my guess would be just kind of, you spend a lot of time talking about the preferred temperatures and dissolved oxygen and where they're going to find it during certain times of the year, I guess would be my only guess.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's no question about it. All these fish have limits, and temperature-wise, and you got to remember, too, speaking of temperature, things are just popping in my head. If you don't mind, I just throw them out.
Oh, absolutely.
You got to realize, temperature-wise, that the cooler the water, within the limits of each species has a limit, a lower limit and an upper limit. But when you get down to that lower limit, they're going to be much slower. They're not going to chase a bait that far. It's got to be easier for them because they're cold-blooded creatures. And in warmer water, they'll chase it faster and farther. So you got to keep that in mind.
And speaking of that too, I want to circle back to that first question. You started talking about the rods and the cones. From what it says in your book, that essentially these fish, they do take a little time to adjust, and it is so much easier for them to see, probably just like a human, early in the morning, right? That's when we don't have to have glasses on, right? I mean, I'm sure we can all nod our heads saying we don't have to have polarized glasses on right before the sun comes up, and same after the sun is set. It's like a perfect light for us, and that made so much sense. The fish are just like humans. We don't want to have to work too hard for something. We're all creatures of habit. We're all a little bit lazy deep down, and these fish are no different. They don't want to have to work twice as hard for a fish if they don't have to. And the same was holding true for these fish in both the evening and the morning. I thought that was pretty cool. And some of these fish, it said, Mark, that they would take a few hours for their light, for their eyes to get adjusted to the light and to the darkness.
Yeah, it's like you say, it takes time. It just doesn't happen in 10 seconds. Anyway. I just get these thoughts popping in my head.
Oh, keep going, my friend.
You talk about the sense of smell, and fish have an incredible sense of smell, but we never think about that. One thing I read was that the eel has the best sense of smell of anything. They can smell a drop of something in a whole swimming pool.
Huh.
But sharks feed on their sense of smell. They do that a lot. And they will track something. They will go. That's why they don't swim straight. They swim erratically, because they'll follow smell to the right. And then when it starts dropping off, they'll move back to the left, and then to the right, and then to the left till they find what's causing the smell.
What did you find? I know you talked a little bit about the smell tracks, if you will. I know you were I don't know, it was co-author, did the introduction on the what fish see, right? and talked about the smell tracks, and you talked about even catfish and human saliva. I thought that was so fascinating that some of these things that we might take for granted, that we have on our hands, whether it be oils or sunscreen or saliva, can actually help or hurt the amount of fish that we catch.
What you're really saying, Joe, and telling our audience is that fish are not simple little creatures that are stupid. I mean, they have incredible knowledge of things, incredible abilities to do things. Another thought popped in my mind, going back to that 30,000 gallon aquarium.
Yeah.
And one day they let me watch these bluefish feed. And they threw a bunch of small live bait fish in there. I'm watching this one bluefish. There's 7 or 8 of them in the tank. I'm watching this one bluefish, and he charges this little bait, and the bait stops dead and freezes, and the bluefish broke off the attack. He came around again. He charged this bait, and the bait didn't move. The bluefish broke off the attack the second time. The third time, the bait fish moved, and the bluefish ate him.
That's wild.
How's that?
So what? Tell us why. What happened?
Because it didn't look natural if the bait wasn't trying to escape from them. And then I'll take that one step further. Fish only feed for a short period of time, and then they stop, and they have to digest the food, and it takes a long time, on and on. I watched them in this aquarium. They fed the fish until they wouldn't eat anymore. And then they threw bigger bait in there, and the fish started eating again. I don't know why. All I'm telling you is things that I've seen, things that are happening, and I've always tried to make the best of them when I'm on the water.
I think one other one that comes to mind from your book, in terms of feeding, of predator fish feeding, and I'm going to pull it up here. It said, this is from the British biologist E.J. Crossman. And he said that predators select and attack one specific victim at a time from everything that he studied. And what you can learn from that is if you can have your either live bait or lure slightly outside of the big school, the big pack that the fish are feeding on, or looking a little bit more hurt or disabled, the chances are going to be much higher of you hooking up versus being right in the middle, looking like everybody else. I thought that was pretty interesting.
That's absolutely correct. What you want to do, and fish are sensitive. You could take 100-pound fish, and you cast a lure out there, and you bring that lure towards a fish in the wrong direction, and you'll spook a 100-pound fish with a little plug that doesn't weigh 6 ounces.
Yep.
Because they don't expect that. So when you see fish on the surface, or you're casting the fish that are there, like there's a whole bunch of there's a school on the surface and they're feeding and all that, you want to cast on the fringes, and you want to go in the same direction that the fish are going, and you want to bring it just outside of where they are so that they can isolate it. As you said, fish do not open their mouths and just feed. They pick one victim at a time and attack it. And that is a critical thing.
That's excellent. And let's talk about eyesight. You mentioned scent, and I know in Paul Johnson's book that you're on there with him, he had actually said that fish can smell, I think it was 1,000 times better than dogs. And, we all associate dogs of just having an amazing gift of smell, which they do. But we also talk a lot about eyesight and how fish react to movement, and that you really, even maybe above scent, you really got to catch the eye of a fish to really have it strike. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, for one thing, Joe, looking through water, and the water is not always crystal clear.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to see any distance. So the fish rely on other faculties, such as the sense of smell or hearing. That lateral line we talked about earlier is a hearing mechanism, and it can pinpoint something to incredible accuracy within 20, 25 feet. And they depend on that. They depend on the sense of smell. I forget how great the sense of smell is, other than knowing that it's very, very good. That's why, for example, if you're fishing bait, if you can get fresh bait that has giving off more smell, you have a better chance of catching fish than something that's been frozen for about 2.5 years and it's not giving off as much smell.
Yep. I love it. What about casting on a calm day? That was another aha moment for me. I think it's one of those that we all know, I think, is fishermen. Most of us kind of prefer to have a little bit of wind, right? Not just to keep us cool in the summer, but on a calm day, it can be incredibly tough to catch fish. And you talk about that, at least in the fish's eye, it's almost like looking up in a mirror, and that when you cast on a calm day and your line settles on the surface, the fish see it as like a long crack in a mirror. Like that's crazy.
Yeah. And a couple of things with that. One is, too many people figure out where the fish should be, and they want to cast a bait or a lure exactly on the fish or where they think that fish is hiding. And that's a big mistake. You want to go past it so that it comes by naturally. Fish will take the position where they can find food that comes by. They'll dart up, grab it, and go back. And that's what you have to do when you're casting, especially on a calm day. You've got to give it more room. You don't want to get too close to the fish, and you want to bring it in a direction that's going away from the fish so he sees it and he chases it. And you should know that the minute they grab an artificial lure, for example, they know that it's not the real thing and they try and spit it out. That's why sharp hooks are critical.
How much time do you have in general with the saltwater fish before they spit it?
I don't know. It depends on the fish.
Are we talking fraction of a second or seconds?
No, I don't think so. Once they take it in their mouth, that hook is going to at least scratch something and keep it there for a short time.
Yeah. That's interesting. Do you think, because you touched on it in the book, but I don't still know the answer. I mean, can fish see the fishing line? I mean, I assume yes. And if so, does it bother them, or times it does bother them and doesn't?
Yeah, probably yes to all of the above.
So you're a Hall of Famer. You caught a lot of fish. I mean, did you have little tricks that you use? I mean, did you go crazy long with your leaders? I mean, is there anything that, I'm talking saltwater specific here, any tips you can give on, just because that's what everyone really wants, right? Is just a better hookup ratio.
What you want is the lightest line that will do a professional job. And depending on the species you're seeking, I mean, it could be 80-pound tests, where if you had 130, you would use that, but you want to use the lightest line that works. You want to use the shortest leaders that you can. You want to know that a steel leader will catch less fish than a monofilament leader. I've never used some of the new stuff because it really came out about the time that I was backing down. So I can't tell you about that.
And you mean like fluoro and?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Well, as I tell a lot of people, old Andy, the brand Andy monofilament still has more world records than anything else by a landslide. Nothing is, and of course, it's been around a long time too. But that's I continue to keep going back to old school mono. It still works. Because I saw a picture in the book, and it seems funny. You had this fish looking up at a bank, and you talk about blind spots with the fish, and
a reflection.
Yeah, and the guy's like literally, on his knee fishing, and can fish see people on a boat, bank, etc.? I'm guessing the answer is yes. And do they? At what point do they care? I guess
they can see him and they can hear him. Let me take you back to this study the PhD was doing with the trout in the stream. Okay?
Yep.
Now, he's got a blind that is back in the woods and raised so that he can get in and out of there with the fish hearing him or seeing him. He took another biologist and he sent him downstream, probably 50 yards, something like that. And this man waded across the stream. And as he did, you could see the trout in front of us start moving and taking a defensive position.
And he was 50 yards away, but they could sense him that far.
You got it.
But
we just don't understand enough about fish, Joe. That's what the problem is.
Yeah, because there's also the argument that, and you talk about it, that fish are curious, right? When there is any kind of movement, yes, they can go on the defense, but they're still curious as well.
Right.
Huh, that's fascinating. You mentioned the line, so if I want to go back to that, do you agree that's one of the biggest mistakes that you see is anglers just going way too heavy on their line, on their tackle?
Absolutely. And hooks that are too big and too heavy and all kinds of stuff like that. My father was an incredible fisherman. My father used a little quarter-ounce yellow bucktail. I saw him catch 100-pound fish on it. And that's all he used. He could put 6 of them in a jacket pocket. You wouldn't even know they were there.
You said it's just a quarter-ounce bucktail?
Yep.
Wow.
But he believed in it. I've heard guys, he couldn't see well because he was old, But I've seen guides say to him, even though you can't see the fish, I'll still fish you because if I point them out to you, you're going to catch them. I don't know how he worked that bucktail. I could never do it, but it was incredible to see.
What was your confidence lure?
I just wrote an article on this. If I had to pick one lure, it would be a white bucktail. And I'd have a white bucktail with probably a bait tail on it, now a plastic tail or a plastic worm.
And why does white work so well time and time again?
I don't know. One thing that I tell people, and most of them don't know this, in World War II, they had survival kits on ships and in airplanes, because if you went down at sea, you'd be floating in a life raft for weeks. And every kit had a white bucktail in it.
Really? That's crazy. That was part of their survival kit.
That is correct.
Huh.
So that they could catch a fish. It's very versatile. You can fish it at any depth. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. And I like lures. I like bait. I like all the other stuff. But if you limited me to one, that would be it. Let me just tell you a story. that tickles me no end.
Yeah.
I used to like to catch tarpon, and in Key West Harbor, we used this little plug that would sink. And we'd throw it out, and it would sink down, and then we'd slowly work it back up towards the surface. Tarpon would eat it. I'm in the African country of Angola on the Kwanzaa River. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to fish tarpon with a native guide. Says to me, Mr. Sosin, there is only one lure that will catch tarpon in these waters, and that is just a trolling spoon. You got to troll the spoon, and eventually a tarpon will eat it. I said to him, Captain, could I just try something, 1 or 2 casts before we start trolling the spoon? He said, absolutely. On the second cast, I put a 100-pound tarpon in the air, and he looked at me. He said, sir, there are now 2 ways to catch tarpon in the Kwanzaa River.
That's great. Did you guys ever try trolling, or did you stick with your method?
Oh, I stuck with my method. We did a little trolling, but, you know, and I tell people this, take the lures that you're familiar with. Take the ones that you really know how to work. And I don't care what water in the world you're fishing. That's what you should use.
I agree. That's it's all about that confidence, bait.
You know, I had every confidence that anywhere in the world, this little plug was going to catch tarpon if I worked it the way I worked it in Key West Harbor.
Yep.
And it did.
That's cool. I want to shift over to noise on a boat. I see a lot of people, and these are our insider members. This is just public people, you know, asking questions from our Facebook comments and YouTube comments, and they feel like they're in the right spot. And if you dig deeper with them, a lot of times it sounds like they are, meaning they're seeing bait. They're even seeing, you know, like redfish or snook. They're seeing boils. There's birds around. They're in the right spot. And yet they're like, man, I just can't get anything to bite. And I feel like it's one of the least talked about things because it's boring, right? We all want to talk about the shiny new lure or liner, leader, or fish finder, but just the noise on the boat. And I thought it was interesting that essentially you can do all the talking you want from, according to your book. You can literally talk to your partner. A lot of people think they have to whisper, but they'll be walking around or dropping their tackle bag on the boat. And it's said here that you can talk all you want because that voice will bounce off the water's surface, but any movement in a boat is magnified like 1,000 times, like a sounding board effect. And the one gentleman, it was the biologist that had studied the effect on sound underwater, that just by flexing his knees in a 21-foot boat, just by literally flexing his knees and like going down to a knee, actually spooked a fish with no foot movement at all. That's literally just doing a knee bend. And I read it twice. I was like, what? And I think that's probably the culprit to so many anglers out there missing fish and they're spooking fish in an area that otherwise is probably a feeding zone. What are your thoughts there?
I agree with you. You know,
well, I hope so. You put it in your book.
Well, I didn't read it last week. But I remembered it. Talking doesn't hurt, especially in a normal voice. But anything that is transmitted through the hull will spook fish, or at least alert them. The problem is, you know, and we need to just make this distinction. It's one thing to spook a fish. It's another to alert a fish that there is something there that is not normal.
Yep.
And then they don't eat.
So true. So it's the vibrations through the hull are the issue, not so much vibrations from like an electric motor, a trolling motor. Is that right?
Well, any kind of vibration or noise can be detrimental.
Okay.
You want to be as quiet as possible. But the other thing or part of this is, they see fish on the surface and 5 boats come racing up there at full speed with the outboards, right up to the fish, and then they expect to catch some of them. Now, you can catch some, but that also alerts the fish. You want to stay on the outside, you want to come up slowly.
Yeah, another thing, the positioning and approach. It's why it's one of the first online courses that we ask our new insider members to go through, and even like full-time guides who have gone through it and said, "Wow, I learned something here," because it just no one's teaching it. I once again, it's kind of like putting in golf, right? It's a little bit boring compared to driving 300 yards, but it's so critical. The putt is usually what makes or breaks the guy making the $1 million versus the one making, 10,000.
I only played golf for a short time in my life, and I was young and strong and could drive a golf ball an incredible distance. And I used to play with this older woman who taught me to play golf, and she could beat me time after time after time because she couldn't drive a great distance. But boy, when she got near that green, she was deadly.
Yep. It's I think that is analogous to the positioning and approach. It's really where it makes or breaks the day.
What we got to leave our listeners to, Joe, is that there's a lot of little things. It isn't something big all the time that's going to spook fish or keep you from catching them. It's little things that you have to adjust to. And that's very important. I mean, being at the right depth, retrieving based on the water temperature, not making noise. Realize that fish will hold in certain spots. If you're working a shoreline, for example, you don't want to cast where the fish really is, like most people do. You want to cast where the water will bring that bait or lure down past where the fish is, and he'll come out and eat it.
Yep.
I don't know if all this makes sense to you or not.
Oh, absolutely. This is incredibly helpful. I want to talk about one type of sound or a vibration that is good, and that's you had titled it distress vibrations. And there is something in the fish's biology, just like us with humans hearing someone cry, but with fish, when there is that distress sound, especially on bait, they perk up. They can sense it, and when they do, they're on. There was one study, I don't have the page. I was on one of these pages I had. I lost it, but it was when they looked at their brain activity, it like everything changed when these predator fish actually just heard that sound of bait. So clearly, predator fish, as we know, they're attracted by vibrations giving off by another fish in distress. And one thing that you shared in the book, Mark, is talking, and I'll actually read it here. If you enjoy fishing live bait, which most of us do, you can often do much better by keeping the bait on the surface and working it so that it will flutter and splash. And you even talked about some of the bridge anglers who do the bridge trolling.
I used to do that.
Yeah, talk about that real quick.
I used to bridge troll.
Yeah, so what is that for people?
You take a live bait, you put it on the surface, and you walk along the bridge, with the rod over the side and the bait on top, just going down over, one load, another one, all the little arcs in the bridge. You just keep going down with this thing, and you'd be surprised what comes out and eats it. There's a lot of things, I mean, I can't even begin to think of all the stuff I've done and how I've done it and what you learn. But if you leave our listeners with a thought, You want to leave them with the thought that it's a bunch of little things that are going to make the difference.
Yep.
I got to bore you with one quick story. At one point in my life, for a short time, I decided I would smoke a couple of cigars. Okay?
Yep.
I'm at a show in California, and there's a man there who is a beautiful fly tyer. And he showed me these flies. He said, these are the greatest sailfish flies ever tied. And I said to him, you see this cigar? I can catch a sailfish on it. And he laughed at me. We're down in Panama shooting the show. And it's 5 PM. The sun is behind a mountain. And we're not shooting anymore. And one of my cameramen was a captain. And he said to me, boss, he said, how many cigars you got? I said, why, you want to smoke one? He said, no, I want to catch a sailfish on one. It's okay. So I gave him a cigar. And he told the local guy, mate, to get out of the way. He rigged the cigar, took a bait rigging needle, went right through it, put line through it and a hook, and put a teaser out there. 15 minutes later, a sailfish comes up. He teases the sailfish. We stop the boat. He jerks the teaser out of the water. I cast a cigar with a fly rod. I move it about 2 or 3 times, and the sailfish charged it. I hooked him. He went airborne, and all you could see was tobacco going in every direction. And my guy said to me, boss, he said, that's not theory anymore. You can catch sailfish on cigars.
Did that make the show?
No.
Oh, that would have been too funny.
But I share this with you to make a point. If you do things right, if you know what you're doing, and certainly this man, my guy who is a captain, knew exactly what to do, you can do amazing things. I mean, hell, I've caught sailfish on bass worms.
Yep. All about being at the right place.
My wife caught one on a white bucktail.
A sailfish.
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
So how we doing?
So what did you do? I think a lot of the listeners now, we're so used to using these free online satellite maps for our pre-trip planning, right? Because, what I'm hearing you say, it's a lot of small stuff, and really at the very top, though, is still putting yourself in the right place at the right time, just like your captain who knew where to find either the permit or the sailfish. The number one priority is obviously, putting yourself in a feeding zone. So all that being said, how did you go about that prior to these online maps? Which, might seem like a silly question, but what did you do for the pre-trip planning? Do you use the old school hard maps? Do you have a network? All the above?
I'm not sure I can answer that. Various things, if I could find somebody locally. Think about this. You have a local guide. He fishes the same spots every day, and the fish are there every day.
Yep.
The same spots. And it's just a matter, if you understand a little bit about fish behavior and what they look for, you look for that kind of spot. For example, if you're fishing a shallow flat and it's an incoming tide, you want to be higher on the flat because the bait's going to be higher on the flat and the fish are going to be higher on the flat. One thing I look for on flats are little sharks. And the reason I look for sharks is they know where the fish are. Think about it.
That's a great tip. Yeah, so if you see little sharks, you're fishing there.
Yeah, well, I know I'm high enough on the flat.
Yep.
On falling tide, I want to look how that water's coming. If it's coming off shallow water into a deeper channel, and the channel's moving towards the sea, then I want to fish that channel or the edges of that channel, because that's where the bait is going to be, and that's where your fish are going to be. It's not hard, Joe. It's just a matter of thinking and trying to figure it out and keeping copious notes. I mean, when you find something or you figure something out, it'll work someplace else too. It's not a one-time thing.
Oh, I agree. And as I read in the book, and just a great reminder is, focus on structure and then focus on bait, right? And you mentioned that in a couple different places in the book. I mean, these fish are like us. They really have two things in their mind. They want to eat and they want to have some shelter. And of course, in their case, they're trying not to get eaten by a shark or a dolphin for our intro species. And so they're looking for structure and they're looking for bait. And then when the current's coming, the current is bringing the bait to them and even disorienting the bait as well. And I think you nailed it on the head so many times in this book about, where to be putting yourself to make sure you have the best chance of getting a strike.
Well, you learn every day on the water, and all I can leave folks with is the idea that be alert, look for things, see what's happening, and make notes of it, because it's going to happen again.
Yep. And you talked about even with, the tide, right? I mean, if all things being equal, if there hadn't been a massive pressure change or a storm, if you have an amazing afternoon or evening at 5 o'clock in a spot, you can pretty much count on that spot's going to be great the next day, 50 minutes or an hour later. Fish, this exact same spot, the fish should be positioned the exact same place. It's not always rocket science. I think many of us give, not to say, you mentioned earlier, the fish aren't dumb, but we sometimes give them too much credit. They can be predictable when you really start talking about and understanding and reading about the science and the biology of it. So this has been super, super helpful.
Think of it, Joe. A fishing guide fishes the same spots every day, and you hire him so that you can catch fish.
Yep. Not rocket science. Not rocket science. Well, my friend Mark, this has been really, really fun. I'm going to make sure we put a link to this book. You've written quite a few other books. How many total now?
I've written 33 books.
Wow.
31 of them. I had publishers for. 2 I published myself. 1 so I could give it away. And the 33rd book, I wrote about things for our family. And it's 100 and some pages of just little stories about our family.
And are you selling that one, or is that more just keep it in the family?
No, I want my grandkids to someday say, I didn't know Grandpa did that.
That's good stuff. And are the rest of them on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or somewhere online or on your site?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know where they are. They're around someplace, but I figured out how to write books. And I had to figure out a lot of stuff. I'll leave you with the thought of being in salt water. I'm known for salt water.
Yep.
The fact that I'm in the Freshwater Hall of Fame and 2 other Halls of Fame had no bearing on it because I was a naval officer on a destroyer. We were taught to look down the road. I looked down the road and I could see that young people were watching television and they weren't reading. So I realized that I had to be on television. Well, I looked at the television market and there were a lot of bass shows and whatever, but nobody in the world was doing salt water, so I did salt water. That immediately made me a saltwater addict. And I used to tell people that I fish freshwater too. And one day, a friend of mine who was an All-American football player grabbed me by the lapels, put his face in mine and said, Sosin, you are the dumbest guy I have ever met. And I said, Dick, You're probably right. Why don't you tell me why? He said, the world is speeding a path to your door to make you Mr. Saltwater, and you tell them that they got the wrong address. He said, keep your mouth shut and go to the bank.
So, hence, you're the saltwater guy. And how many years did your show air?
27, and then my wife made me quit.
Love it. We'll definitely put some embed some of the videos. I know they're out there on YouTube. Just a great show, an amazing book and / books. Do you have any? Do you have a 34th in your head?
No, sir.
Done, huh?
I'm done. Let somebody else do it.
Love it. Well, Mark, thank you so much for the time. This has been super enjoyable. I know the audience really, really love this. And where can they go connect with you? Do you do any of the social media stuff? I know you have a website we'll put a link to.
I have a website with my name backwards, Sosin Mark at Outlook.com.
Got it. And I know you're on Facebook. I don't know how active, but I know we're friends.
I don't do much these days. I write a couple columns a month. That's it.
Yeah. And who do you write for?
I write for Coastal Angler, and I write for Texas Outdoor Journal.
I got it. Cool. Still writing for them. That's great.
I don't want to write for the big guys anymore because it's too much of a hassle. These guys are happy to have my stuff, and that's it.
Yep. Well, I know we appreciate you, my friend, and especially if you find the rest of that manuscript, I would love to read it.
If I find it, Joe, I'll call you.
Please do. We'll have to do a second show where we talk about the lost manuscript to Through the Fish's Eyes.
I like it.
Well, thank you again, Mark. Everyone, if you have any questions for us, we'll put some of the notes, the show notes, and also some videos of Mark from his show, all at saltstrong.com/podcast. We appreciate all of you, and we will talk to you on the next show. Thank you again, Mark.
Yes, sir.
'Cause fishing, it's in my soul. It was